morning, everyone. I'm so delighted to see all of you gathered here today. My name is Angela Thorpe, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. So again, thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the first webinar in the Commission's 8-part webinar series, Growing Our Griots, Strengthening North Carolina's Black Heritage Keepers. During this series, we will explore how our state's Black heritage institutions can execute innovative and sustainable work with the insights of a diversity of culture workers from across the state and across the country, like today's guest, who I will introduce shortly. The North Carolina African American Heritage Commission received the American Rescue Plan Humanities Project Support Grant from North Carolina Humanities to execute this series. And you can learn more about North Carolina Humanities online at www.nchumanities.org. Funding for the American Rescue Plan has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. Just a bit of housekeeping today. Please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat. That chat will be monitored and we'll be answering questions throughout, as well as at the end of the presentation. I also want to take time to thank the members of my team who made today possible. Adrian Nearday, Associate Director of the African American Heritage Commission, Miranda Clinton, who is a graduate student in North Carolina State University's Public History program, and Miranda's work is being funded through this grant. I also want to offer a special hello to John Cooper, B. Pearson, Catalina Lopez, and Winifred Query. These are graduate and undergraduate students at UNC Greensboro, Wake Forest University, Belmont Abbey College, and Winston-Salem State University, and they are joining us due to this funding as well. Today's webinar will be available via recording, and we'll send that recording out to all participants following today's presentation, along with the survey. As a note, the next webinar in this series will take place on Tuesday, April 12th at 1:00 p.m. And we'll be having a conversation with Adrian Nearday, Associate Director of the African American Heritage Commission, and Adrienne Burney, Outreach Coordinator for the State Archives of North Carolina. And these women will be talking to us about emergency preparedness and collections management in African American cultural spaces. So without further ado, I am thrilled to welcome our presenter for today, Melissa Timo, Historic Cemetery Specialist for the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. And Melissa's full bio is available online via the Commission's website. Melissa, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. All right, I'm going to share my screen because everything's better with pictures. All right, so yes, I'm with the I'm with the Office of State Archaeology. I work very closely with the African American Heritage Commission as part of a special program that a joint program that we're working on together. I am originally from the cemetery program, which is a program with two main goals. One is to record cemeteries and get that data so that we have the knowledge of these resources and their communities. And my second part is to help people, whether they're communities, descendants, any citizens of North Carolina and beyond who have questions about how to take care of cemeteries, what to do if something happens. And so our sort of partnership with the African American Heritage Commission was sort of a natural one. We were both getting lots of calls about the African American cemeteries in our state and trying to figure out the best way forward to support these places and to support their people. And so the project was born, and we have forthcoming information, website, lots of things of it that will soon be available for the public to see. But in the meanwhile, you can reach out to me directly, and my contact information will be at the end. So today we're covering sort of a whole gamut of stuff. So I apologize if I'm going to blow through some of this very quickly. There'll be time for questions, and also you'll have my contact information so you can call or email me if you have additional questions. So pretty much what we're going to cover is the places themselves and what to expect when you are in them and looking for them. And then we're going to move on to sort of a managerial end, sort of the long-term care and maintenance of these cemeteries. So first we'll cover where you might find them. And we have two, the first of course is the early pre-emancipation cemeteries. And these cemeteries were often places located in places that were sort of imposed upon enslaved communities. They were on marginal land or on the backside of Euro-American cemeteries. But because they were sort of tucked out of the way, once you understand the layout of say a plantation or an enslaver's property like that, then it helps us predict where we might find them, because these places often aren't very well marked. And for an example, up in Warren County, we have this cemetery you can see in the yellow circle that the descendants have decided to call the Slave Cemetery at Clearview Plantation. Clearview Plantation was a big old plantation, had something like 5,000 to 6,000 acres. And this cemetery, which is in the yellow circle, looks like it's in the middle of a field, which is not marginal, unproductive land, but it does still fit the pattern. The arrow at the top is pointing out to one of the business centers and one of the homes of this plantation where the white operations, the enslavers' operations, came out of. The red arrow on the bottom is pointing to a stand of trees that once housed a farm outbuilding. So this cemetery is located out of the way, behind where the white folk were, out of sight. And this red line here is indicating a sort of drop off. So this is land where there's a landform change, and this is not usable land. There's a whole bunch of rocks in there. So it fits the pattern of being, within a mile of the white, especially the houses, and then out of the way on unproductive land. You can see this across the eastern United States and into the Caribbean. As we move out of emancipation into the late 19th and early 20th century, we still see some marginality to these cemeteries. For example, the Fitzgerald Cemetery in the top right-hand corner is sort of tucked on the edge of Maplewood Cemetery in Durham. But you also see it dividing between the white community and the African-American community, or tucked up against other community centers. For example, at the bottom there, the Olive Hill Cemetery is right next to the Olive Hill High School, and immediately behind the photographer is a former furniture factory. So it's where people were working, where people were going to school, and then the neighborhoods that surround it. So at the heart of the community. So there are patterns that can help us understand these places. It's just a matter of knowing the history of the landscape. Now, as we move into the cemetery itself, there are things that we can look for, because a lot of, especially if we move back into the period of enslavement, the cemeteries were often marked with very sort of temporary markers or nondescript markers, both because that was what they may or may not have been allowed. And also there's this idea that you're confined to one space. You have this idea that there's always room for the one more. The cemeteries rarely fill up from these communities because it's important to keep the community together. So if you can shift the headstone aside, or memorial aside a little bit, then there might be room to squeeze in one more person so that nobody's excluded from these places. So that becomes problematic though when trying to identify graves or individuals, but it's kind of powerful to imagine these places as a memorial to a community, not just to individuals. So what we might see are, especially in the Piedmont, and into sort of Western North Carolina, are fieldstone markers. These may be special shapes, or they could just be what is at hand. And you can see both of these two cemeteries demonstrate that. You may also find these fieldstone markers in places where there are formal markers, like this enslaved community section of a white enslavers cemetery. So even though they're attached to a place, they're not isolated, they still have these fieldstone markers. You might also see other temporary markers. If you're lucky, there is a bit of survivor bias because these wooden markers are very telling. However, they're made of wood and we live in North Carolina, and these type of things don't survive in the ground very long. They might take the form of just simple posts or stakes in the ground, or they could be these sort of people-shaped markers. You can see in the big picture in the middle there are actually two markers, one with a round head and one with sort of a pointed or head with a hat on it. And these are deep traditions that come straight from Western and Central Africa with ancestor worship from there, that's sort of transposed into an American version that we sometimes are lucky enough to see. As we move on, we see a lot of homemade markers, which are my favorite markers because you can see how much effort and love that the community puts into these markers. Even if they couldn't afford a granite one, they still wanted to make very sure that these people were remembered. However, that does mean that the forms come in all kinds of varieties, so categorizing them is tricky. But I think that's the best part. You can see available resources, you can see money that's spent, you can see time period from what's left behind. There are also trends in formal or purchased headstones. And one that I've noticed throughout the Piedmont and into sort of the coast, I haven't done as much work with this in the western part of the state, are the markers that look like this, sort of half round tops with ivy, with that's either a motif that's either plain ivy, ivy with a dove, or ivy with an anchor, and this particular font. And I only find these in African-American cemeteries. And I don't know where they come from, but they must have been something that's well known because I see them literally all across the state from, you can see Durham, the central part, Sanford, I've seen them on the coast. So these are all, this is clearly something is happening. There might be an African-American artisan, there might be some known community resource. Everybody's buying for them. I need to do more research to find out that this story. But if you see them that look like this, it might be more than likely is associated with an African-American individual. You also see a lot of funeral home markers left in place. These are designed to be temporary markers starting in the late 19th century, around 1880, as funerals move from home affairs to commercial affairs. These were designed to be temporary. They were metal, tin, aluminum, iron, with a glass or plastic plate that protects a card that's either handwritten or printed with the deceased information. And with the many African-American communities, these were either left in place because they were making do or because that was acceptable. And sometimes, as you can see in the bottom right-hand picture, they're incorporated with a more formal marker that's created at home later. So that one was set into concrete. These were used, the one on the top right there is 2000. So these are continued to be used, and they can be found plentiful. So as you're going through them, watch your feet because they are kind of fragile and you don't want to crush them. As you can see, this funeral home in Southport is making them even fancier with maybe with the idea that people are still using them. Because for this example, this gentleman also has a formal granite marker, but they've kept this one in place because it has that nice picture probably. And so these continued to be used beyond their temporary idea or origins. You also see material goods tied in with many, especially pre-emancipation, just getting into post-emancipation time period. These are traditions, both ceremonial and personal ties of these artifacts to traditions from Central and West Africa. Things that tie in with water, things that hold water, reflect water, personal items, have to do with ideas of the soul, have to do with the afterlife. All of these things can be really imbued with power and significance. But the tricky part is that oftentimes, as you can see in these historic photos, they are left in place, but if you aren't aware of what you're looking at, they could be mistaken as, say, a potential trash dump or, a midden of some sort. And so it's really important to pay attention and not clear these things off to the side, because these might be the marker or what's left of a marker. And so removing them is potentially erasing the idea of where that grave is. So if you are working within the cemetery and you have questions about, are you looking at just trash, or if you are looking at a grave good, then you can reach out to me via email, take a picture, send it to me, and I'll help you interpret what you're seeing. Another thing, following along the same lines, especially with the idea of the symbolism of water, are shells. You see this mostly along the coastal area, where sort of influenced by the Gullah Geechee community. The Gullah Geechee corridor is considered to travel pretty much halfway up the North Carolina coast. So we can just imagine that all the communities that lived along the coast are influenced by these ideas. And shells, whelk shells, are prominently used. However, if you look at the one from Sanford on the left-hand side, there are no beachfront property in Sanford. So that is telling me a story that I would like to know. Is this person originally from the coastal community, from a Gullah Geechee background? How did this shell get from the coast all the way inland to Sanford? Why? There are still some communities that keep this tradition, not just something of the past, but keep it alive. This is the John N. Smith Cemetery in Southport, North Carolina. It was recently added to the National Register of Historic Places. This is tied to a living Gullah Geechee community, and graves like this one, the shells are refreshed almost every year. And so if you're ever in Southport, please check this cemetery out. It is really cool to see these traditions as all the ones you might see in fragmentary pieces elsewhere, kept alive and what they would have looked like at the time when they were first created. These may not, in the modern day, these old traditions still pop up, but maybe not in the original way. It may not tie to some of the old ideas about the afterlife or traditions from Central and Western Africa, but they still sort of evolve into ways that how cemeteries are quote unquote supposed to be, the aesthetics that you expect to find in the cemetery. So instead of having, say, glass or mirrors or even hubcaps that sort of represent the reflective properties of water that you might see in a pre-emancipation or just post-emancipation cemetery, like you can see in the pictures on the left, you might see solar-powered garden lights or those round florist pebbles that reflect the light in the same way. You may not see the use of shell, but you may see shell motifs, waterside motifs. All of these people that you see in the picture are directly related. So they are in two different cemeteries, believe two different things possibly, but they're continuing this tradition of what I expect to my grave to look at. look like. And it's a really cool tradition to see these traditions march straight from Central and West Africa all the way into the New World, into the 21st century. Other things you should be aware of, especially in older cemeteries or cemeteries that have not had attention in a long time: walls, obviously, curbing, whether that be permanent curbing like a cement curb built in, or it could be made of brick or cinder block. Mounds, whether they're large scale mounds or mounds covering individual graves. These have multiple reasons why they were created, although I know of some studies that show pre-emancipation African and African American communities repurposing Native American pre-contact mounds for their burials because it's not a productive land. It's a hill that's tricky to plow over, but it's recognized that this is clearly a special place. So there have been some studies, I believe in Georgia and Alabama, I think it is, where enslaved communities reuse these places as their own cemeteries. And I would love to find documentation of that continuing in North Carolina, because there are mounds in North Carolina. But they could be individual mounded graves as well. Also, keep your eye out for depressions, especially in cemeteries that have not had attention. And I like these pictures because depressions are really hard to take pictures of, but there were these nice shadows from the trees to show you these. These happen when the either the coffins collapse or the natural settling over time. And cemeteries where there's an active community often go back later to continually fill in these settled places. But if there isn't a community visiting regularly, they might become pretty clear, whether they just are slumped or they're actually, in the picture on the lower right, you can actually almost see the four corners of that particular grave. Another thing you should watch out for, in addition to wooden markers and stones and depressions, are plants. They can help in two ways. If you look at variations in ground cover, like grasses, you can use that where a grave is, a water will pool, and where there's more water, the grass will grow taller. And that might help you identify where unmarked or no longer marked graves are. But other plants are placed there as a memorial. Periwinkle we see a lot, palms, yucca, grasses, bulbs. All of these things act as or accompany memorials. And I want to make sure, as a tip, that you go back to the cemetery that you're looking at multiple times a year to make sure you don't miss any of these plant signatures. For example, the picture on the top right shows some bulbs. I visited that cemetery with people who had been working to champion this cemetery for years, but they had never been to the cemetery in that part of the spring, so they didn't realize that there were memorial bulbs planted at this graveside. So make sure you go back. And it's important to note these things and not remove them, because plants, artifacts, shells, and pieces of headstones all are considered memorials under North Carolina law. All cemeteries are protected, whether they're in private or public lands in North Carolina. However, it's not just the headstones and the bodies we're looking at for, because these things are acting as or in part of a memorial. They are protected under North Carolina's general statutes, especially 14-148 and 14-149. So removing them might, because, well, like I had mentioned before, might erase the memory of that grave. That's considered an offense, so they need to stay in place. So now you've identified where this cemetery is and you want to start working in there, doing things to it, taking care of it, memorializing it. What do you need to do? First things first, get permission to be there. There are statutes, 65-101 and 65-102, protect your reasonable access to visit a cemetery, to visit, maintain, restore, discover graves or cemeteries. However, that reasonable permission, that reasonable is a word you should remember, because you just can't go, especially on private property, into a private property, cross the private property willy-nilly to get there. It is private property, and the private property laws are very strong in the United States. So the reasonable means, if you are looking at these cemeteries and you want to visit, have a plan. Approach the landowner, and you can find their information on county geographic information systems. Just type in, say, Wake County GIS, and you can type in the address to find who the owner is. You go to them and say, I would like to visit this cemetery. I plan to go there. My sister and I plan to go there Saturday, May 14th. We will plan to be there in the morning, and we are going to be taking pictures. Have this plan laid out so you can begin the negotiations for access. Sometimes people don't care. Sometimes people care a lot. And 65102 is to help you get there if the landowners are being persnickety, and it's essentially going through the courts. So once you get in there, the first thought of people, especially if a cemetery has not received attention in a long time, first thing you want to do is rush in there and clean it up and make it look right again. First of all, cemeteries aren't supposed to look like anything. Second of all, you have to make an assessment of the cemetery to figure out what is the best path to go forward through first. I always recommend forms, not just because I'm an archaeologist and a scientist and I like documentation, but also if you're visiting a lot of cemeteries, having a standardized way of assessing and documenting cemeteries will just save you a lot of hassle in the long run. And there are lots of free forms like this one from the Jukora Foundation that you can find online and use for your own purposes. And these are things like, if we visit here, is there a place for us to park? Can our older folk come and visit, or are there too many tripping hazards? Are the headstones leaning really precariously and it's just not safe? There are lots of terrible stories of children being killed or maimed because a headstone fell on them. You want to take that seriously before you have a group of people out there. Same thing I always tell people to look out first is the trees. You can spend a ton of money cleaning things up and restoring headstones, but if your tree, the beautiful atmospheric live oak or whatever tree is in your cemetery, is damaged or dead and falls over in the first storm and crushes all of your good work, all of that money will have gone to waste. So trees can be expensive to take care of, so that might be more important to devote your early fundraising efforts to than the headstones themselves. Also look at safety, not just the safety of your volunteers being there. Is it a safe place for people to go? But also look at, is clearing the cemetery completely a good idea? Do we need to have a plan in place? Because are we now exposing something that nobody knew was there at all, but now we're opening it up and we might have some vandals or we might have people hanging out there that we don't want to. So there are lots of things that you need to think really carefully about, because the goal is to make sure these places survive for a really long time. And that's where I encourage people to develop a management plan. Short-term goals, long-term goals. Sit down, figure it out. Then you don't have, people running all over the place doing 75 different things for the same cemetery. And so deal with who owns the cemetery. Does it have no owner? Do you need to talk to the city or the county about that? Look at the grounds, look at the accessibility and the safety. Do we need to get game cameras out there or signage to make sure people are aware that this place is something to be protected? Only after you addressed all these early issues can you move into cleaning and recording it. Then you can do the harder studies, the surveys, the GPR surveys, the restoration efforts. And finally, think about long-term investment in this place. You might be very involved and passionate about this place, but you're not going to live forever. None of us are. So it's important to develop a system, a community of support around these places. that also has to include, is this place going to continue or to be used, or is it going to be closed as a cemetery? How do we bring the neighbors or the surrounding community or descendants in? Do we want to have a website or Facebook group to share information? How do we raise money and perpetual funds to take care of this? Do we want to memorialize it, especially in a place that does not have any memorial surviving or never had memorials? How do we want this place to be remembered? And then do we want signage? Do we want to make it in as a part of a tour of greater African-American heritage in the community? All of these things should be addressed so that you have people care about this for years, decades, a century to come. So now we've got a plan in place. So we're going to move forward with the cleanup. Cleanups, I encourage people to think very carefully about that, because this is a non-renewable resource. You're going to want to make sure that you do things carefully the first time, because these things can't really be replaced. And the first thing with cleanups is actually removing vegetation. The path of least resistance in a cemetery is a grave shaft, and you don't want to pull things up, even things like, say, grapevines, if you don't know what might come with the roots. And so trim it off, come back multiple times a year to keep things like vines at bay. Use something, if you're not going to use hand tools, people laugh at me, but goats are a great way to eat back pesky things like English ivy or kudzu or poison ivy. Arlington National Cemetery, they use goats to get through this heavy these heavy undergrowth, and you can rent goats from places. If you are using equipment, small equipment like small mowers or weed eaters, make sure you pay attention to where you're going, or instruct your team to be careful around the headstones. You can see the damage on the right-hand side from weed eaters, and there are many stories of stones being knocked over by lawn mowers. I also want to encourage you, take pictures every step of the way. This documentation will be helpful for you to understand the cemetery as it changes over the years, and also is a great tool for marketing, for help, and for applying for grants and aid. If they know how things have changed and know the problems, know the solutions that you've seen so far, it inspires people to help you, or ideally throw lots of money at you. So take pictures before, so that you can show people afterwards what you're seeing. And in this picture, you can't see anything here, but all of those white flags are marking fieldstone markers that uncovered themselves as we eliminated all the down trees and brush in that cemetery. So I want to tell people my number one question is, how do I get money to help take care of this place? And unfortunately, there are no grants or state funds available for landscaping or general maintenance. Do not exist. So you're going to have to look at local efforts. And that might come in the form of volunteers. And you can find volunteers to do this stuff all over the place. Not just the descendants and the neighbors. You can look at university service clubs. Eagle Scout projects are great in cemeteries. They also have to raise funds to do their projects. So that's funding you don't have to pay for. Community groups like Chamber of Commerce, Rotary clubs, churches, or reservists are great. You've got the sort of muscle power to help you get through some of these things. Special interest groups. These are all great partners, and especially if you're able to develop partnerships with several of them. If you ask one group to come out multiple times a year, that might be asking too much. But if you can get 4 groups to come out once a year, you've got your growing season taken care of. If they One comes out in April, one comes out in June, one comes out in August, one comes out in September. You've got things taken care of. So look around you. There might be help right in your own backyard. Now, as far as taking the care of the headstones themselves, this includes field stone markers all the way up through purchase markers. You have to treat them very carefully because they could be of materials and that are very soft. And you don't want to do anything that impacts the surface. That's why think of headstones as you would your teeth. You don't want to use things like powerful chemicals or sandblasters or power washers, because we don't want to eat away at the patina of the stone. The patina is separating the interior of the stone from its arch nemesis, water. Water can break apart stone. Think of the Grand Canyon. So the cleaners that are most recommended by groups like the National Park Service are the top 5 that they did a study on. And the top 5 were D2 biological solution, which you can purchase online, EnviroClean, BioWash, Modec MDF 500, and Revive. The industry standard is D2 biological solution, which is a great material. It's an anti-biologic spray, and it is non-toxic, and it's great because you can cut it 1-to-1 with water, or even 2-to-1 with water, depending on your stone. So you can make a purchase last a lot longer. And these will work on the staining. They will also work on sort of the mosses and the molds and the lichens and the saps that sort of worm their way into microfissures on the surface. If you have really tough stains, like environmental deposits or bird droppings, Orvis can be used as a spot treatment. But generally, if you use D2 or even just plain water does a great job, as long as you're allowing the stone to dry. Your tools want to be soft. So think of brushes with plastic or natural fiber bristles. And a lot of these I get them from the dollar store, things like nail brushes and vegetable brushes, animal brushes, things like that are really cheap. You can get a whole pack of toothbrushes to get into the letters, or use something like wooden skewers that soften with water, or popsicle sticks to get out the things from the nooks and crannies. Also, you need a ton of water to clean these headstones. So that's why I mentioned the reservists before. I worked with Army Reservist Group who bring those big water buffaloes. They're the giant containers that are used for emergency supplies of water. They'll bring one of those with you, so that if you're in a cemetery that has no spigot or pump system, that you can have water on hand. Because what you need to do to clean a headstone is, first you need to wet it down to soften everything, give everything a good brush. I like circular motions. Get all that that sort of rough stuff off first, rinse it. If you're using a cleaner, you can spray that down, let it set for a minute or two, then go in with circular motions to clean off the materials. Choose either top to bottom or bottom to top. It doesn't matter which way, just pick one. Then you rinse that again. You might want to repeat the process if you're using just water, or even if it's heavily soiled and you have a D2 biological solution. The nice part about D2 is even after you've rinsed it the final time, it's good. That D2 will look great that day, as you can see in the top right hand corner, but it continues to act up to 3 years to get into those microfissures, to get to start killing off all that stuff inside, which is good, because you really shouldn't clean headstones more than every 5 to 7 years, because you don't want to impact the surface. And even good techniques being used can work on erode the surface over time. The next thing you should do is document your cemetery. Take more pictures. Take pictures of the entire cemetery from each side, north, south, east, west. take pictures like Jason Harp is in the top there, dead on the headstone, not angled downward, standing above. These pictures are good to document the health of the stone, but also if you want to get restorers in to fix broken stones, they're going to want to see really good, clear pictures of what the damage is. Always take pictures in better light, early morning, late afternoon, where the light is coming at sort of like a 45-degree angle. And if you're there at a different time and you don't have that natural advantage, you can bring a mirror, a flashlight, or even a photographer's reflector, like you see in the bottom center, to create that raking light. I recently bought some photographer reflectors on Amazon for 13 bucks, so they're not too expensive. Drawing maps are also a good idea to understand the landscape, especially if there's a natural disaster. Even having a rough map that isn't to scale will help us understand what the cemetery looks like if the worst happens, like you can see the top right-hand corner. I also highly recommend that you fill out one of our historic cemetery reporting forms to submit your cemetery to the state registry of sites. Your cemetery just has to be at least 50 years old to be added to our registry. We have these forms that are for civilians, that are for citizens, that are easy to fill out, that give us basic information about what the cemetery looks like, who used it, or if you don't know any of that information. The most important thing we ask people is to have a really good location, because we want to put a flag on the state map so that we can help people avoid impacting these cemeteries. And the nice part is, even if you don't have a GPS, there are easy ways to get coordinates. You can see on the bottom right-hand side, that map is Google Earth. And if you hover your cursor over the cemetery, which I have circled in yellow, you can see the bottom right-hand side, Google Earth will tell you the coordinates of this cemetery. And so that can be very helpful for us so that we're able to tell people how to avoid this. So these forms can be found on our website, which I'll show you at the end. This is, like I said, a great place for us to know more about these places. Oftentimes, African-American cemeteries have not been recorded with past county-wide cemetery surveys. So no one knows where they are. I joke everybody's auntie knows where the cemetery is, but if she passes away and nobody's been there, then how can we help protect it if we don't know it's there? It's also great for management planning or disaster planning. In the past, if I've seen a grant pop up that a cemetery might be eligible for, I'll check my map, see where those are, contact the people on the form to let them know that this is available. And these could be cemeteries on public or private lands. It doesn't matter. Any cemetery, as long as it was established at least 50 years ago, can be added. We also welcome, besides maps and photographs and obviously the form itself, anything else that tells this cemetery's story. Land records, family stories, photographs of people who are buried there, death certificates that prove somebody's there, even though the headstone doesn't say they are. All of this stuff is welcome to help us understand these places. Now, what if you can't read the headstone? There are lots of techniques that people have employed to sort of enhance them, to make them more readable. All of these are common that you see on the screen, none of which I recommend. Again, anything that sort of leans or rubs on the stone over time is not a great idea, because it breaks down that stone surface. So like rubbing, if one person does it, okay, but if people do it over time because the impression is getting fainter and fainter and fainter, then that rubbing is actually actively assisting that degradation. Also, all of these materials here, bleach, shaving foam, cornstarch, and chalk, they all have elements to them, chemical or abrasive elements that can break down. So like shaving cream has chemicals in it that can erode the surface. Chalk has all kinds of, besides just abrasiveness, have all kinds of terrible things in it. Even children's chalk has all kinds of terrible elements in that can add to the breakdown of the stone. Bleach, like you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, will eat at marble. It'll make it white, but it'll break it down, and it has this, will result in this sort of sugar texture. It's actually called sugaring, which is essentially what rust is to marble. So that is basically the stone decomposing. So all of these things you want to avoid. You also, if the stone is really, really hot, if you go there in the summer, don't put cold water on it, because that can also cause breaks. And don't use water, even though water is the safest, if it's too cold, because it won't dry, and that expanding and contracting might cause fissures or breaks on the stone itself. So take a really good picture is your answer. Take a picture, make sure you have the lighting right. Take a good picture, even with your phone these days, and bring that well-lit picture into basic phone editing software. Play around with the light levels, maybe the contrast, and you'll be amazed at what things pop up. If it just still isn't readable, sometimes that just means it's gone, and it's better to work to protect it than to work hard to read it. Next steps are the research steps, and to learn more about the cemetery and its community, especially if you don't have a lot of information, because there's a lot of mystery cemeteries out there. It can be as simple as genealogical work about the individuals, about the community, about the land use around it. And this can be done by anybody these days, thanks to places like ancestry.com, and our North Carolina library systems have great resources. This can be done by descendants, community groups, high school students. This is a great student project. There are more complicated surveys, though, that are very helpful, that do require more professionals because they have equipment that the average Joe doesn't have. So delineation surveys, trying to find where the edges of a cemetery are, where the graves stop, or surveying for where the property lines should be. These are probably people that you want to hire to do it professionally. Or you could get a university or graduate departments to come out to do that as well. I can't guarantee with the university that you will get it done, but if you are patient and you have time, it is a possibility. They might use equipment like you can see in sort of the back left of the picture. That tripod there is a total station, which makes a sub-centimeter accurate map of where all the resources are in a cemetery. Geophysical surveys are these remote sensing, these pulses into the earth that show where subsurface features like graves are, like ground penetrating radar is the most common. This you will definitely need either a university with the equipment or to hire professionals, because this equipment is not cheap. It's a subfield of a subfield of a subfield, which means it's also kind of pricey. There are a few grant opportunities, but for the most part, this is thousands of dollars that you might end up needing to have to raise or find a partner for, because it's really useful, but it can be pricey. But I have, if you're looking for that angle, I have lists of people who are U.S. Secretary of Interior qualified to do this work. You don't want to have engineering or utilities companies that use ground penetrating radar for the identification of building sites and for utility lines to do this type of work. Although cheaper, they don't often have the equipment that can go to the depth that you need, nor the training to identify graves, especially old graves like pre-emancipation communities can be very faint signatures underground. They may not have even had caskets or coffins rather, let alone vaults and caskets. So it's a very faint signature, and you need somebody who is trained and has experience identifying these things to do the work correctly, or they might leave somebody out. We don't want that to happen. I got lists of people, just reach out to me and I can connect you. After that, and we've got everything moving forward in our management plan, we might look at repairs. And damage comes from a variety of places. It can be because some humans are terrible people, bored kids, people who are hateful, people who are looking to steal things to make money. That is out there, but there's also internal failures of the stones themselves. You can see some better pictures of the sugaring. They're on the bottom left of marble that's being eroded. It can be from use of bleach, but it also acid rain can really impact marble stones. Marble is pretty and white, but a very soft stone and probably was not the best choice of materials. But also if you have soft stone like soapstone, which you can find a lot in the western part of the state. That is a very soft stone, soapstone, steatite, which is used for markers, but can become damaged over time. Also, if you have sedimentary rock like slate or some types of sandstone that are used, they can actually come apart at the seams. They're sedimentary seams. You can see they're spalling where parts will pop off, or delamination. Or even things like this granite marker, which ordinarily granite lasts for a really long time, but there wasn't a good seal between the upright part and the base. So water, which again, natural enemy of stone, got between the two pieces and got to the metal pins that were holding the two pieces together. And as it expanded, as these pins rusted, it caused the stone to crack from the interior. All of these things, most of this damage from human inflicted to natural faults, I'm going to always recommend that you get unless you've taken a class, hire a professional. Raise the money to do it correct, because if you do it incorrectly with bad epoxies, with bad cements, with metal, even if they look nice, like the one encased in cement in the bottom center, they are not the right materials. They'll obscure the stone, and they may even hasten degradation because they're trapping water or materials in the stone. And then there are other questionable materials like the bottom and left hand corner. I always include because I have so many questions. Why did that person think that that was a good idea to string it together with wire? Not only is that a real questionable method, but again, now we've got rusting metal on the surface of marble, and that is a terrible idea. So make sure you, like I said, unless you've been to a course to take care of these places, hire somebody, because you might end up doing more damage in the long run than not. And I got lists. Finally, we're going to look at how to keep these trains moving, because all the passion in the world means nothing if the funds run out, the energy often runs out. Well, first, I always recommend, especially if it's a family cemetery, beginning an endowment for perpetual care purposes, for the landscaping aspects. I can't counsel you on endowments because I'm an archaeologist and that's not my specialty. But endowments are great because, remember, there are no landscaping grants anywhere. There might be some tree grants for like storm preparedness or good neighbor type grants, but there are no one's going to pay for people to landscape. So you're going to have to find a way to keep a pot of money available for that if you can't get long-term partners. Grants are often used for research purposes, for ground penetrating radar, for those mapping surveys, for land surveys. These are out there, but they're often only awarded to nonprofits or people with nonprofit partners or organizational partners, just because that's the nature of grants. And they're not very many. And the ones that are there are competitive. I do have lists for you if you email me. You might find more grants for educational purposes. Educational grants can be used for interpretation. They might be able to be used for some restoration efforts. But I always tell people to look outside the box, to think outside the box for grants for cemeteries. For example, if your cemetery, I get a lot of calls of these lately from Charlotte, where there are small cemeteries located in different neighborhoods in urban Charlotte that are in disrepair. Well, if you look at those, they could, that sort of broken windows theory. If so, making this neglected place look good is good for the neighborhood. So looking for good neighbor grants to bring in lighting or benches or things like garbage cans, that might be an avenue to go for. Storm preparedness grants. Is a tree going to fall in there and potentially harm people around it? You might want to look at a storm preparedness grant. There is this website called NC Grant Watch, which you do have to have a membership for, but if you don't want to pay the money for it, a lot of libraries have a membership for it, so you can just visit those to get access to that website. So you have to think of the cemeteries in sort of a roundabout way to be able to convince the funders that these are also the same problems, just in an unusual place like a cemetery. And so you might have to be creative with that. Even with the educational grants, think of like, I want ground penetrating radar to happen here. Well, what I can maybe do is apply for an educational grant for a 3-day youth historic preservation job exposure camp. And we'll bring them to a museum, we'll bring them to talk to the state, to talk to the state researchers. And on the 3rd day, we'll demonstrate a ground penetrating radar specialist job. But we have to pay the ground penetrating radar specialist to bring their equipment out there and do the survey. So you include the costs of that survey for that day of the camp into your grant. So think big and think creatively to explain to these people who aren't expecting to fund a cemetery project why this fits their mission. Finally, there's lots of resources out there. You can visit our website, which is the Archaeology program website is at the top there. There are also lots of great webinars and articles on the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training website. The Association for Gravestone Studies is an avocational group for people who love cemeteries that you can join. More people who are conservators, in addition to my list, can be found on the American Institute for Conservation. Then if you're looking to go through the sort of tricky process of getting a cemetery on the National Register, we do have state staff at the Historic Preservation Office who can help you, but the sort of qualifications and sort of getting a background of what it takes to get one of these on there, I would recommend and the National Register for Historic Places Bulletin 41 for the guidelines for cemeteries, and Bulletin 38 for the guidelines for traditional cultural properties, because sometimes these cemeteries are the only thing left representing an African American community. And so I would argue that they are a traditional cultural property, just like a Native American sacred site. And so approaching it from these two angles might make this effort more successful. Then there's my information. If you've want to call me or send me an email with questions in the future, then you can find me there. There's our website again. You can also find us on Facebook, where we'll be advertising new website updates, as well as future workshops, things like that. If you want to go above my head, because I'm not giving you the right answers, you can reach out to John Mintz, who's the state archaeologist, and his contact information is there on the bottom left-hand corner. And I believe that is all that I have. So I will stop sharing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa. You covered an incredible amount of ground. This presentation was incredibly thorough and useful. And again, we will be getting out this recording and those slides out to all of you presenters in the near future. I was monitoring questions in the chat along with Adrian Nearday. And so, Deborah, I think Melissa just answered your question regarding historical designation, specifically regarding the National Register process. to reiterate that Bulletin 38 and 41 are good starting points for research. You can then reach out to the National Register Coordinator at the State Historic Preservation Office to get additional guidance on that process. One question that I'll offer up to you, Melissa, because I think we've got time for perhaps one, can you talk a little bit about best practices for mapping cemeteries, for mapping Black cemeteries? Thank you.
That is not something that everybody thinks about, but mapping, like I said, can be very important. And the easiest way to do that is, especially if you're working with a group of people, is to divide it into a checkerboard, divide it into a grid and break it down. Divide it, and I can't give you what way to divide it up into a grid because every cemetery is sort of shaped differently. But if you divide it into roughly the same size pieces, put you can buy those pin flags that like utilities companies use, the little flags with the neon colored signs at the top, from Lowe's for like 100 for $10 or whatever. And you can mark where your corners are to help people not overlap. And then bring out your piece of graph paper and then use that to say, here is a headstone, here is a depression, here is a shell. And even if it's just a rough idea, if you're able to have a grid so that all your pieces of graph paper line up together, that makes it easier. Archaeologists love mapping things in squares, and not because people necessarily were operating within squares, like Native American houses were often round, but because squares are really easy to map and they don't require a lot of thought. It's a natural thing. So that's what I suggest, is for people to break things down into small pieces, like anything that's hard, and include everything, include the trees, include patches of periwinkle, include anything that's there that could be a clue to understand what is happening there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa. And Taylor, to the question that you just posed in the chat, the best strategy is to try to work through the National Register process. That's the most appropriate process to get a historical designation for a cemetery. Some local preservation offices, so you might have a preservation planner that's local or attached to your city or county government. They might have a different designation process as well. We do see that in some cases. Well, we want to honor everybody's time. It is 2 o'clock, and so I think it's about time for us to let you go. We have put Melissa's chat in, or put Melissa's email in the chat. And so if you have further questions, you are welcome to schedule a one-on-one with her by email. Melissa is incredibly accessible and really wonderful at helping to guide you through questions. So that is melissa.timo@ncdcr.gov for any additional questions that you might have. Thank you all so much for joining us today.